all time. It is Soundgarden's second highest rated album behind 1994's Super Unknown, which we are going to cover in a future episode.
Yes.
Badmotorfinger did not make it on. None of these albums made it on Rolling Stone's list tonight. And Soundgarden is ranked number 170 of overall artist rankings on best ever albums.
Yeah, and honestly, the reason they don't is because it's a bonus episode, and most of the albums that did are in our regular episodes. So, yeah, before we turn it over to you, Matt, for the first take, I guess this would be the third appearance of the Big Four of grunge. We did do Bleach by Nirvana before, and we have done Facelift by Alice in Chains. Josh and I did, and so now we've got Nirvana, and we haven't gotten Pearl Jam yet. But actually, we haven't gotten to any of their most famous albums yet. So we're proto grunge right now. So, what'd you think of Badmotorfinger?
Yeah, I have this album, and I know I've told stories in the past about how I've traded albums away, like inferior albums, and I've gotten or better albums, and I've gotten worse albums. Well, this is an example of me getting an album that was a net positive, right, for me. So, I forgot what I traded for this, but so Soundgarden, it was good going back to this for me because my initial reaction to Badmotorfinger back in the day was like, wow, this is it's a heavy record first and foremost to me. It's a sludgy, heavy, dark sounding kind of grunge that they're going here. It's equal parts metal and punk as well. And I don't think I was ready for this heavy of a sound at the time that I got it. So for me, it was like it's an album that I listened to like the first 5 or 6 songs, and I was like, okay, I'm good. Like, you know, I never fully gave it its due. So, and never really went back to it. You know, maybe here or there heard some songs from it, but. So I liked going back to it this week because I definitely connected with it more now, you know, and so that's what stands out: the heaviness, the sludginess of it, and Chris Cornell's voice obviously is just unbelievable. Like just the soaring, how he's able to hit the notes, and it's like it's very dramatic, operatic, kind of voice, and it sounds great. He's a metal singer in here. You know, this is like some Dio level pipes that he's showing off here. So it's got great sounding, full sounding guitar riffs. The band is very tight, and there's a lot of, and then, some stuff will be more elaborate, going in different directions. Like even Rusty Cage, it's only 4.5 minutes long, but there's like 2 separate distinct parts, kind of more of an upbeat, driving rock sound in the beginning, and then it goes into more of a sludgier, slowed down, heavier sound that they go for, but it sounds great. I also love the version that Johnny Cash did. That's one of the songs that Rick Rubin had Johnny Cash cover. That sounds totally different when Johnny Cash does it, but I love both versions of that song. But it just goes from one song to the next. Like Outshined is great, Slaves and Bulldozers is great. I really liked Jesus Christ Pose this time around. All these are very, very grungy type songs. And, for me growing up, as far as the grunge goes, those of the 4 bands, I was definitely more of a Pearl Jam, Nirvana guy than I was a Soundgarden and Alice in Chains guy. And I know that Alice in Chains is heavy as well. So I'm going to be interested to hear some of their stuff because I really don't know any of their records, but, and I know.
Really? I didn't know you weren't that familiar with Alice in Chains.
I know Alice in Chains singles. I never owned an Alice in Chains album. So, but they had a lot of singles, right? Like I definitely remember hearing them on the radio, and I'm sure I had friends that had records that I heard of theirs here and there, but I can't say that I'm familiar with them, right? Like I definitely knew a lot of this album, and I certainly know a lot of Super Unknown. That's an album that I'm probably even more familiar with, but yeah, it ends really well. Like Holy Water is a great song. I like the way it ends with New Damage. Room 1,000 Years Wide was really interesting. I mean, they got these horns that they're using at the end. There's kind of like this freeform jazz at some parts. It's that I found interesting. So, yeah, very heavy, very kick ass. So yeah, I liked hearing this one again.
Yeah, I enjoy this album, but this was an interesting listen for me, Matt, because I'm familiar with this, albeit haven't listened to it in a while. Mm-hmm. And much of what I love about Soundgarden is the sludginess, is the versatility, because they can slow it down and play more straight ahead rock and roll too, you'll often hear that they're the most traditional, right, of the big four Seattle bands. Chris Cornell, obviously vocally, is a powerhouse. He drives himself into so many songs, and there's an emotion in his singing that just comes through. But I couldn't help but think, Matt, that this is an album of its time. This sounded like 1991, and that's not a bad thing. For
Mm-hmm.
me, that's, I wouldn't say nostalgia, but it's a sound that's appealing. It's a sound that's familiar. But I can't help but think that if you were born, say, in the last 15 to 20 years, this would strike you as old sounding, right? Like your classic rock sound, like a sound of another era. And I was trying to think like what would be the equivalent of this for someone now for me, and it would be something from the 60s but sounds like the 60s. And so while it doesn't sound like
Crosby,
it,
Stills, and Nash.
right, or Jefferson Airplane, right, would be
Mm-hmm.
another something like that. Like an album I
Okay.
like, but it's like, okay, that's 1966 or 67, right? Or in Crosby, Stills and Nash, right? That's 70 or 71.
Yep.
And I don't think I would have ever processed Soundgarden being so of their time, but especially since we're listening to a variety of stuff right now, and I can kind of see what's leading to stuff, what is reminiscent of it, what's in the peak of stuff, and the fact that rock music is evolving to all of these different things.
Mm-hmm.
I think of this as being the sound of the early 90s,
Yeah.
kind of.
Yep.
And that's not a bad thing for me, but it was a striking thing for me to process because, like I said, having listened to this album, I never thought of it in that way. And I don't know if we hadn't done this podcast, Matt, if I ever would have thought that. I would have thought like, oh, listen to the. I would have processed it a lot more like you did because I had the same takes, right? The same sounds, the same views on the guitar. I liked the highlights were the same songs that you did. I thought it was a consistent album across the board. I didn't think there were too many weak tracks on this album.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it also, I looked at this as sort of wetting the table for Super Unknown and what was coming. I still feel like Soundgarden was completely exploring their sound. They were, Outshined, I think, is the first song. Rusty Cage too, but Outshine truly was the first song where I'm like, okay, that is the Soundgarden sound that would come back throughout the 90s, right? The all the pieces, right? The big sludgy riffs, but building to a big chorus. The Chris Cornell really belting out the lyrics, but also the transition toward the end. In that case, the dun 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 dun, who gets crucified, the different sounds, right? And then leading
Mm-hmm.
into that great big chorus. And yeah, great song. One of the best songs of the early 90s, Outshined for me. It's everything that I like in music. So, definite thumbs up for this one. But with the caveat of if you've never listened to this before, I would say it's of its time.
Yeah, and I agree with that because when I heard this record, I was taken back to that. I'm like, yeah, that's kind of the sound of that time. And like you, I'm okay with that. I don't even know if I would say this needs a caveat. I mean, I don't unless you have a bias against early '90s rock sound. I wouldn't say it's generic though. I think there's a difference between something that's of its time
Well,
and something that's generic.
I think the
Are you?
reason
Would you draw a
facelift.
contrast there?
Well, I think Nirvana kind of it's not so much of its time because it sounds like other things that came before it. So, you can draw lines to punk and stuff in the 80s with
Yeah.
Nirvana that doesn't couch it as 1991. And of course, what we covered in Bleach was late 80s. The Alice in Chains album we covered, Facelift, sounds different than a lot of what's coming later because it's still very much a metal album. So it
Mm-hmm.
locks in a lot with like 80s metal. And then so many bands tried to copy Alice in Chains sound in the late 90s, early 2000s that you hear their sound right later. But I guess I didn't realize that Soundgarden, right, does not dig back as much or have antecedents later that are as much. It's like sort of like Soundgarden exists, in this time period. And like you said, that's not a bad thing, but I guess I never thought, oh, they're of all of the ones, and we haven't done Pearl Jam. Maybe that would be the same thing, but I doubt it because they're still playing and stuff and have a little bit of a nostalgic feel to them because of the Neil Young thing and stuff that puts them outside of it.
And you know, grunge is a very '90s sound, right? I mean, it's a genre that
late
that's
'80s,
kind of,
early '90s, yeah. Mm-hmm.
yeah, okay. So but that's where it lived, and you know, anytime nowadays, if you hear a band kind of doing that, you're going to be like, oh, that's a, you know, there's that's a grunge thing. That's certainly not a more of a modern sound. And you know,
It's
in
kind of
a
the
way,
sludginess, I think, that is what marks this album compared to the other
yeah.
ones.
Well, and maybe that's the sound of Soundgarden really honing in what the core of grunge is and would become, you know. So in that sense, you know, because they are, I mean, there's elements of Black Sabbath in here. There's elements of, you know, like different kinds of, you know, like something like Face Pollution or Drawing Flies. It's kind of more, I mean, I'm like, okay, there's some punk happening here, but they are melding it. They are kind of taking some of the things that have happened before but making it more of its own thing, but also that still sounds very much rooted in that time. So I don't know. To me, it's not a knock. I mean, I like that sound. I like the '90s, you know, early mid '90s grunge, you know, type sound for the most part. And maybe if you have a bias against that, then I guess I would say that warn you of that listening to this, but it's still, at the end of the day, to me, there's enough riffs and there's still hooks in here. There's still, you know, impressive vocalization. There's great. Matt Cameron's a great drummer. We haven't mentioned him at all, but he's shining in a lot of places here for me. And it's a I think I'm certainly more ready. I was more ready to listen to this album now than I was as a kid for whatever reason, because I think around this time as a kid I was going through a transition of my musical, you know, tastes and, you know, kind of trying to expand things. Because as we mentioned earlier, hair metal was more my thing, which is a very sheened version of this and lighter version of this. But I think that knowing more now, what, you know, I was more ready to listen to this, I think, this time around.
Fair point. So I can't disagree with that. I can agree with you on that, Matt, that it had a more mature feel for me than where I was at. You would have been, what, around 13 when this came out? I would have been around 11 when this came out. So yeah, this album, I think, aims slightly older than that. Like, I don't think you come to Soundgarden first as the band that moves you. I think you have iterations before you get that. And some of that's because of the heaviness of it, because of the lack of shininess or pop sensibility that I think when you first are listening to music draws you to some other things. Even the dynamic energy, like, I don't think you'd get to Nirvana first, but you know, when you could see how you could, for example, start with Pearl Jam, though, right?
Yes.
For sure. And so,
and that was the band of all the four. That was the one that I probably gravitated towards.
And they're more of the gate, you know, even flow is easy to understand as a gateway drug in a way that as good as Outshined is or Rusty Cage, those are not, or Jesus Christ Pose or stuff on this album, right? You're great songs, but I don't think you get there first. So, thumbs up for me, though.
Yeah, and with Super Unknown, it'll be interesting to go to that because I think they definitely expand, right? They kind of, that's a more accessible record as well, and that's probably why I listened to that one way more than I listened to this one. But
but keeps a lot of the hallmarks of this, though. They don't abandon a lot.
No, they
don't.
DNA. No, they don't. But they just expand a little bit more. But yeah, this is pretty kick-ass. So I liked going back to it.
I did too, and this was the only album I didn't get feedback on. I think Josh mentioned in a text to us, I think, that he thought...
he did. I think... No,
he thought that they sound like the Foo Fighters, right? He kind of said, which...
He said this would be the Foo Fighters if the Foo Fighters were good, I think is what he said.
Okay. I can't say I co-sign that opinion right there. I don't see... I guess maybe the first Foo Fighters album, which I don't know if we're covering. I know we're covering Color in the Shape, but I don't hear a lot. Dave Grohl kind of sings, especially early Foo Fighters, in a grunge style, but I don't think he's singing similar to sounding like Chris Cornell.
Yeah, and I don't know enough. Foo Fighters is fine. Foo Fighters is more straight ahead rock, and this is heavier. I don't know, but I mean,
Like I would never call
Foo
the Foo
Fighters is
Fighters
the residential.
sludgy.
No, but Foo Fighters is kind of like that's like the residential, rock band today. That's like just the straight ahead rock band that's selling out arenas and that's still very popular, still selling records and stuff like that. Which most rock bands are not doing that. So
there is a differentiation between the Foo Fighters of the '90s and later, though, too, which will.
Oh sure.
Get
Oh
to,
yeah.
but
Oh yeah.
Mhm.
Well, they started in '94. They're still making records today. Here, Josh actually made a distinction. He says Soundgarden. He's like, what if the Foo Fighters were heavier and good, is what he said.
Okay,
so he's recognizing that obviously that this is heavier than the
Well,
Foo
give
Fighters,
us
but
feedback.
he liked this.
Give us feedback list. Yeah, he definitely, he said he was down with it. And we're quickly realizing that Josh has a little bit less familiarity with the grunge icons, right, than we do. But based on how he felt about Facelift and then this one, I don't think I think it's starting to come true to fruition, right? That this is a sound that appeals to Josh's ears. Mm-hmm. So we'll see as he continues to go on how he feels. But
it appeals to me too, John.
I know, but you're a nostalgic person, so like we always have to like take away the nostalgia,
I know it's
icon,
hard.
and I in the nicest way possible try to challenge you sometimes on the nostalgia sheen, which we joked about. The '90s is gonna be tough for you on that because it's gonna be peak nostalgia for you. So
yeah.
Yep. So,
but it's hard when you've listened to, whether it's my nostalgia or somebody else's, when you associate a record, a band, and with a certain time or whatever that you really resonated with. It's like, even if it doesn't hold up as much as it used to, they're still gonna, like hair metal for me. It certainly doesn't hold up the way that I thought it might, or the way I liked it back when I was a kid. But I still like it. It's still kind of Flight of the Angels was number 2 tonight for me. So they're still, but of course, like everything else, I am biased with my musical opinions. So
I think the key is just identifying it, like where it would deviate from your norm and stuff. And I think you do a very good job of that.
Yeah.
So let's just keep gassing each other up. The listeners are like, yeah, move on to something else. And maybe what we